Welcome, Pathfinders and all wandering wanderers eager to explore paths to better tech futures together. We are Tethic's firekeepers, Alia Isakovic and Matthew Mitka, inviting you to reflect on the lunacy of tech and explore the paths not so well traveled. Each podcast episode is a meandering exploration inspired by the seeds planted in our Pathfinders newsletter at the beginning of the lunation cycle and the paths illuminated during our full moon gathering. You can find more about us and our pathfinding adventure at tethix.co/pathfinders. In this lunation cycle, we were inspired by the saying, "You are what you eat," and wondered what it means for AI golems that have ingested terabytes of data from often questionable sources. The guiding question for today's exploration is, what data are we feeding to our AI models, and what are they turning into? So, nice guiding question to get us started, Matt. What are your initial thoughts on this?
Yeah, it is. There's so much to, unpack with this particular framing question as a starting point. But what a wonderful starting point for the conversation about these technologies, considering that they are based upon data, the stories, the information, the knowledge, the wisdom, the patterns in that data and information of humanity, and a reflection of not necessarily maybe just our biases and the way that we represent the world, but also, I guess, a reflection of the current paradigm. I mean, this is all information and data primarily that exists on the internet. And as we know, despite maybe desires and movements that existed, and emerged, in the 90s around what was happening with this amazing technology that had come out of all places, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. There was a lot of aspiration about what this technology was going to be able to do, and that never necessarily came to pass in, I guess, the beliefs that might have been espoused in something like the Clue Train Manifesto. And the data kind of reflects this paradigm, this model of the world represented in the data. And I guess, there's some interesting kind of things that we've double clicked on as we've explored this question as part of our rituals with the New Moons letter, from the interesting article, and project that looks at models all the way down. And what I found actually quite interesting in that one was just, and this was the largest image data set that has in it the alt text, and the alt text representing a whole bunch of things around why we actually put images up on the web as well, particularly oriented around search engine optimization and
e-commerce.
And e-commerce, right? So these images of products and people and things, things to represent aspects of our world, are infused by this quite strong commercial orientation to be, on the first page of Google as a, kind of higher order goal for people that are optimizing alt text for images. So, yeah, I think it's just we have to acknowledge that these technologies, like, you are what you eat, and these golems, these technologies have been fed things that represent, a distorted view of the world, because it is a representation, but also just reflect the values in the technology, because we're talking about digital for the most part, and our digital technologies are a reflection of the values and the mindsets and the worldviews at the heart of our current paradigm.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that we keep being surprised by the way these AI models behave. And, we keep being surprised by our own biases and ways of seeing the world being reflected back at us. I often get a feeling that people almost expect these AI models to gain some sort of unbiased intelligence and an unbiased view of the world, but we don't actually have unbiased data on the internet. It's biased in so many ways, not just in terms of values, in terms of languages as well. We know that English, for instance, is disproportionately represented on the internet. When we look, at language that people actually speak in the world, English is not the predominant language as it is on the internet. So yeah, it's interesting to see what these AI models are turning into, what interests do they have. We often talk about the fascinating research where they find that tricks that work with humans, such as, take a deep breath, think about this problem carefully, also work on AI models because they learn from our data and how we think about the world and ourselves and the tricks we use to think through problems. It's just fascinating how many people are still surprised that these AI models are a reflection of us.
Yeah, and I think it's this. Yeah, what is that surprise? Where does it come from? To some degree, most people that are using these technologies in the general public, just they're not familiar with how they develop them, and the be that the data and development life cycle, the data supply chain, and all of a sudden, we're getting these biases reflected in the output of these systems. Be that racial bias in hiring and recruiting, or that okay, well, yeah, take a deep breath. Here's how to break down this problem as a kind of prompt to give ChatGPT or Gemini or what have you, and they get this output that kind of reflects. So it's it is really interesting. Even ourselves, like myself, like knowing these technologies, or at least having some insight into how they've developed and from being involved in this type of technology for the past several years. Myself, I'm human. I'm surprised. I get delighted. I get dismayed. I get hopeful. I get fearful. I get bewildered, and also feel sadness, hope, loss, all these different emotions. And it's interesting thinking about how these technologies and the outputs that come from these technologies, these systems, reflect our world and distort our world. And thinking about the types of feedback loops that we're creating when, like we've seen over the past 18 months, just the adoption and use of these technologies and integration into so many different sectors and business models, from education to finance to insurance to healthcare, to strategic decision making that might be done in business, to product development, marketing, and name a kind of sector domain. And these technologies are so infused, but then just the general kind of purpose aspect of them, that it's just being used by so many people. And how is that data, thinking about that ongoing training that we have, where so much of the data that we're creating now is a reflection of outputs and interactions with these technologies.
Yeah, I think, part of the surprise or part of the problem we have in understanding what these AI models are is that we have not developed the right mental models, or even, we know that we're searching for the right metaphor to describe what this thing is, because we're using, in some ways, old mental models from, traditional ways of programming computers where the programmer decides and writes every line of code and determines the behavior of the computer program. And that, just doesn't work the same way with like even machine learning, where you have like hyperparameter tweaking, which is more almost like art than science in some ways. And with large language models, this difference is even greater because it's actually the data that determines so much of the behavior. There's nobody at OpenAI, at Google, all these companies deciding how a model will act. They just, throw these large amounts of data at the models or algorithms as they train them. And you get a model that, then sometimes behaves unexpectedly. And because we cannot quite understand it, I think we're all still struggling, what is this thing? Is it intelligent, right? We've seen cases of employees saying, or, being panicked that suddenly they've developed something sentient. And in some ways, we also don't have shared definitions and understanding of what these words like intelligence, consciousness mean, right? So I think, we develop this technology and we don't have the models and metaphors to even understand it well. So we're mixing some old ways of understanding technology and computer programs with new ones, probably mixed with our rich mythology of, golems, which is something we also play with in the new newsletter. And it's all getting mixed, and we're confused because it's new. It almost feels like a person that you're talking to because of the interface, the chat-based interface. But then it's not. But then it's also a computer program. So what exactly is it, right?
We've got a plane coming over. It's probably picking up on that lovely reflections of our world.
Yeah, I mean, but that's good, actually. We are all physical humans based in our physical spaces. Like something like ChatGPT doesn't get planes and trains passing by. It's wonderful. Like it's much more clean in its execution, not unbothered by weather, moon phases, and all these things. So just goes to show we're actual humans recording in actual physical world. So I think hopefully the background removal algorithm will leave some of that variety and local flavor in.
The beautiful data that comes out in these things, and is the idea of like, I mean, what you were saying there, just focusing on like the mental models and the language that we use to describe these systems. I mean, so much of our language as our first technology, particularly written language, is metaphor. It's simile, it's allegory, it's analogy. They're representations of the world that we're trying to get at, and not the world's representations of it and descriptions of it, at least through our sensory experience and through our observations and developing a set of skills in the use of these technologies, language as these technologies. We try to describe it, but I mean, coming back to the surprise, the sense of surprise, the emotions that we're experiencing, it's because these technologies, and in particular like generative AI technologies based on these large language models and transformer technologies, it's new. I mean, we've been interacting with AI and algorithmic systems for decades in various ways, and they've obviously advanced quite a lot over that period of time. But we've seen this exponential curve as a result of the natural language processing and the large language models, the adversarial networks, neural networks that have been developed, and Now it feels like, yeah, it's not theoretical, it's not science fiction. We're actually doing it. We're interacting it. We're forming relations with these technologies, and it's so much more part of our lives. Coming back to this embodied aspect, I'm kind of interacting with ChatGPT today, early this morning, reflecting on some things that were kind of relevant to this conversation in terms of the data, information, knowledge, and wisdom pyramid that's represented in information and knowledge management. It's kind of this model of understanding the different layers of abstraction and, just reflecting on imagination as this unique human cognition or cognitive process that we have, and where imagination fits into that, and what wisdom is about in terms of the pattern recognition to be able to reflect on higher order values and things that matter to people. And I'm going through this, and as I use ChatGPT in particular, I have conversations with it. It's kind of like my sketch buddy, my linguistics sketch buddy, to kind of have conversations. Probably 80% of my interactions with the technology is not necessarily specific output focused, where I'm trying to actually, do some specific prompt engineering. It's like, I'm curious. I don't necessarily have anyone in this present moment as I'm going through this thought process to reflect on. So I can easily pull out this, this technology and kind of start interacting with it. And interestingly, as I'm going through this conversation with it, kind of diving into the infusion of imagination and the uniqueness of that to human cognition, it starting to go, well, like, how do you kind of visualize this? And it's kind of wild, the things that it comes up with, purely because it doesn't have this embodied sensory understanding of space. So its suggestions were just crap. And I'm like,
it's not weighed down by reality, right?
Yeah.
In physics.
But even designing like a flat two-dimensional visual for this, I had a picture in my head, I'm describing it, but even that, its sense of contrast, its sense of space and dimensionality is just missing in its description. Or I'm not able to relate to the way that it's constructing this description of what a visual might look like. So yeah, like, what is, when we come to this embodied, we're embodied beings, we live in the world, we exist in the world, we relate and are interrelated to our world. How is that gap, between like the data that we've provided for these systems to be trained on, missing a whole bunch of fidelity in the data, and like you said, to a large extent, these models, there's weighting of parameters and things like that, and tweaking of models, but in large part, it's the data, it's what we feed them.
Yeah, exactly, and it's the data that is available right now in large quantities for these AI models to be trained on is, just digital representations of how we see the world, but it's, it's mediated. It's not direct feelings and experiences that we have. It's not even, the direct sensory experience or whatever. It's only the data that we were able to convert into pixels or, bits and bytes of written world through largely a keyboard. And that's, very already a very limited subset of how we experience the world, because not every human, even has access to these tools or is able to express themselves well through the written world using digital tools. Sometimes we forget that not everyone, is on the internet and putting stuff online, because we live in this, Western bubble where we have the internet in our fridges and we do so much work through the written world, and the keyboard is our tool of trade for a lot of us, right? So this is, a very limited view of the world. and that's what the AI models are capable of, kind of bouncing back, but without being tied to reality. Also, as you were saying, like using ChatGPT as a kind of brainstorming, thinking partner. I was reminded in programming, right? We have this concept of rubber ducking, where basically, you pick an inanimate object and just have conversations out loud, and just by the act of talking and expressing your frustrations and dilemmas as a programmer through your body and through the instrument of voice, right? And your entire body. Sometimes you uncover solutions, and it's not even necessary for the rubber duck to talk back at you. And I've been bouncing ideas of my cats regularly for a long time, and I don't even need them. I mean, I hallucinate their replies in my head on my own. So I think humans have been doing something similar for actually a long time, probably. Talking to various living inanimate things in that environment to get more clarity, because so much of the sense making we do actually is through our voice and body and moving through the world, right? But that makes me think, now that we are interacting with these chatbots through text, although ChatGPT does have a voice enabled interface as well, so maybe that's a different feeling. And I haven't been using it yet. Maybe I should try and see how that feels. But it still doesn't have a body, and the data that we have has a clear bias. And as we know, it's very weird. The acronym Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So that is the representation of the world that is available, and that's what also coming back at you as you bounce ideas off it. Even though it's sometimes creative, the grounding, it's model of the world, if it has one, is grounded in this weird data, and that's something I think it's important to be mindful of, and question the answers. Where could that understanding, view of the world come from? What are the underlying assumptions of this data?
Yeah, and that's I mean, a few really kind of interesting points you bring up there, like the rubber ducking, and just the existence of that in the world, be that your cats, or for myself, I've got like a shower curtain where there's giraffes and tigers and elephants and things like that on there for partly because I've got kids, but I like animals as well. But I have conversations with them, and imagine what the giraffe would say, or probably very different, because you've got quite a intuitive understanding of the personality of a cat compared to the personality that I'm projecting onto the representation of an elephant on my shower curtains. But it exists in the world, and we've got this kind of relationship with it. So how when we're dealing with, I don't know, these systems, am I relating to the object and representation as it exists through the brand? Like when I open the app on my phone, as an example, we've got the logo of OpenAI. So what is that relationship? What are the dynamics of that relationship that we're forming, a connections to, and how is that represented in our own bodies? The somatic processing that we actually do. But also just the point you made, just the fact that the data that we have that's been used to train these models is just so skewed. Like here in Australia, a weird country, we still have a digital divide. We've got like 20, almost 1 in 5 people are still struggle to access the internet and digital technologies. What of yeah, the views of the world, the connections to and representations of the world, just that it's missing, and that we're getting that reflected back on us as we interact with these systems and continually iterate upon them.
Yeah, and it's hard to know what we're missing. I think that that's the problem, because we are so used, like the saying with culture, when fish meet each other and they ask how's the water, and like the fish goes, what water? Because you're swimming in that water and you're not seeing, you're not really thinking about it, because it's just there. And us weird people certainly have a view of the world where everybody is online, everybody knows how to use this technology, everybody can express themselves clearly in written language and all these tools. But what we've been seeing on social media, when people like share how they interact with these models, it's often surprising. And the way they think about computers and the questions they ask them, I think for a techie like myself, is often surprising, because yeah, people have developed their own mental models of what these things are. And we've seen that even with Google search, right? I'm always surprised, but like a lot of people, still, even talk to Google, like or any search engine, as if it were ChatGPT, and just like ask questions, not really, having the right mental model of how a search engine operates. And yeah, in some ways, I guess chatting with ChatGPT is easier, because you can talk more like a human, but not everyone is comfortable with the written language. But also, wanted to add something when you mentioned that, the personalities we project. It's also interesting to observe that all these different models that we play with, from, Google's Gemini, Claude, and ChatGPT, to me, it seems like they all almost have different personalities. And I almost feel like I have a different relationship with each of them. And some way, like, I have a way of talking that's different with each of these models, which obviously, like, it's some reflection of the data they were fed on, and yeah, the feedback and how they were fine-tuned. But it's interesting that we're projecting different personalities on them, I would say. I'm not saying that they have like personalities like we do. But it's interesting. And so, like, an interesting question, right, that we arrived is, if we assume that we reach some sort of artificial general intelligence, right, AGI, that these companies are talking about, and let's make a lot of assumptions that it's possible that we get this really intelligent, sentient artificial being or whatever. An interesting question is, what personality what would they be like as a person? Would they be more like Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Sam Altman, Andreessen, or would they be more like Jesus, Buddha? What is their personality? What are the values that we would get theoretically once we get AGI? And I think, this question is not actually being asked enough, because we just assume like this almost godlike entity emerges. But what is that entity like in terms of personality, goals, desires, values?
Yeah, and that's a really fascinating way to kind of think about it. Like, put aside like the lack of embodiment, the disembodiment that these technologies really are. But as we relate to them in this kind of interface, it's human-like. The original Turing test, like, whoa, like we're way past that.
Yeah,
In terms of
we completely forgotten. Like, I've people who just stopped talking about the Turing test,
yeah,
because
yeah.
it's like, let's forget we ever had that as a goal, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've moved past it so quickly, particularly
Yeah.
over the past 12 months. And like, we relate to these technologies and interact with it in language, this very human, deeply human, very neurophysiologically and biologically connected to our evolution. Uh, and what is, like, we get to that, assumptions aside about what that is with AGI. Yeah, what is it? Is it Jesus or Buddha or Zuckerberg or Mother Teresa or um, it's a reflection essentially of the data, reflection of what is used to uh, build the representation of the world uh, that is going to be reflected back in these technologies. And I guess we got to ask the question is like, what should it like be? Like, what do we
Yeah.
want it to be? What is the personality of it? If we're thinking about the overwhelming bias that these technologies have in terms of the paradigm that they represent, this weird paradigm of the world, um, how is it also uh, then reflecting that back on us? How do we challenge that? How do we actually create more data, human generated data? And I think it's worth us just kind of circling back on the pollution of data sets as a result of these technologies being used more. But like, what do we, how do we actually create an alternative, a shift in the paradigm that the data represents so that we get something that is more like Buddha or Mary Curie or, Mother Teresa than, Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or Lex Friedman. Um,
Yeah, that's an excellent question worth reflecting on, because we often, in conversations with AI, we often feel so powerless in the sense of like we cannot, determine its evolution of this technology. We do not have a say in how it's deployed, but we, yeah, we are actually the people, even though like each of us individually contributed probably just a small sample in the data set, but collectively, right, we, with the things that we put on the internet, have trained these models, and the models are in a way a reflection of us. But yeah, perhaps there is not enough data that would teach it different ways of seeing the world and thinking about the world, different metaphors, different uses of language. So I think, that's the power we often like don't realize we have, and we should exercise more. A lot of people, now these companies allow you to opt in of using your website data out of training. But for me personally, I, I gladly allow their robots and scrapers to visit my website because, I'm a bit, critical about technology in some ways, ask maybe different questions. And I would like future versions of ChatGPT to read my blog and maybe, learn something from that, get a different perspective. So yeah, is
yeah,
that's where we have the power?
yeah, and that's an interesting question just on the the power that we often don't recognize that we have, that we are all creators of the stories that represent the world in many ways. And yes, there's socio-economic, political, cultural forces at play that mean that there's certain viewpoints that come to the surface. Our algorithmically curated social media environments obviously don't help with the type of polarization, rage and indignation and things like that that they tend to trigger in the expression of our humanity in the data that we create. But yeah, that like I want these technologies to reflect, probably things that are very on the edge of the distribution of views of the world that like me and you talk about, that like I publish on my blog, that you publish on your blog, that others publish on their blog. But how the models and the technology itself, the business models around it uh, work, um, doesn't necessarily enable uh, like a value exchange between that. Now, will openly want to give my view of the world to shape these technologies, but even engage in some practices where on LinkedIn, for instance, with the collaborative articles that LinkedIn has rolled out recently, probably I think over the last 6 months, although it was piloted likely before that. I want to, like, I'm upset that they are harvesting and engaging in ongoing extractive surveillance capitalism. And if that's collective intelligence, I don't want us to be engaging collective intelligence if that is what these big tech companies think collective intelligence is. But I'm intentionally like putting alternative views. Like if it asks a question on, what does leadership represent in teams that are dealing with the constraints around AI development? And I'll talk about like making a cake, purely because I'm responding to this business model around the technology in a way that is kind of demonstrating some exercising of my agency. Like yeah, there's a whole set of incentives on the LinkedIn platform for me to get represented as a thought leader by contributing to these collaborative articles in a meaningful way, and I can, but I choose not to because I don't agree with the business model, the extractive paradigm that this actually comes from. So, like, I'm exercising that agency in that way and that power, but also what you're getting at too is there's something maybe richer and more nuanced about maybe the collective power that we have as creators of the stories that represent our world, that we need to be able to tap into.
Yeah, I think the question of incentives is a good one, because the data that we currently do have on the internet, and we touched upon that at the beginning with images that were mostly produced to sell goods on the internet. So the problem is that we've been feeding data that's been written, optimized for a certain type of engagement, rewarded by the algorithms. And, what we write on our blogs is not optimized for engagement, even though, like we have the knowledge of SEO and then all, algorithms. We often, we find joy and fulfillment in writing our, thoughts and sharing the way we see the world with others to start conversations, not to, sell things. Which, doesn't make it easy to pay bills, but we think is a worthy pursuit. And yeah, that's a problem, because there's a large representation in data that's been produced for certain commercial purposes and to farm engagement. So, for instance, if we look at YouTube videos, there's, obviously a lot of great content, but, especially in the last years, as people started making money on YouTube as creators, they, started making videos in certain ways that is being rewarded by algorithms. And that the aim of the data is to reach a certain scale, not, impact and have meaningful conversation. Like everything is in the service of, clicks and views and instant satisfaction and reactions, to keep the algorithm happy. We see, like, just look at YouTube thumbnails, for instance, they are not a representation of the world, and with, with the best practices that all, experts, gurus, content experts advise you to do, right, in those exaggerated expressions and flashy titles. That's not how we would naturally interact with each other and communicate with each other, but it's what, gets the click amidst the noise. So, we have to keep that in mind. And yeah, the question is, about the value exchange and how we can make our lived experience an offering in a way, that's then not being sold back to us. Because I mean, I have a problem. Like you said, I don't have a problem, offering my view, my thoughts of the world to these AI models. But then I have a problem when I'm being asked to pay a monthly subscription to be able to access this knowledge, right? So we are, as creators, are contributing to the commons, but the companies and the way their business models are set up, they're still extractive, and they extract so much from the commons, from energy, materials, water, and yeah, there's also the question of cost and the economy related to all of this.
Yeah, and there's a couple of really important, or what I think are important points, just to kind of double click on and narrow in on there. Like, firstly, just that idea of accounting and, like, the true cost accounting that doesn't get done when we're thinking about these technologies. And then secondly, just the incentives, that we have, and the values that those incentives represent around things like productivity and efficiency, and the highest order value of the economy, that tends to be represented in these weird technologies. And I'll just kind of touch on that, the latter one, because it's something that we haven't necessarily dived into, and thinking about optimizing for productivity, right? And so much of these technologies are really designed to and marketed as productivity enhancers, like, increasing your output. Like, we were talking about this the other day, right? I don't want fucking LinkedIn, like, get generative AI. I want to write the post myself. Come on. And at every possible little interaction, they're trying to, like, nudge you towards using these tools to create content. And just how much more content is coming online now, that is then used to train these models, and the challenge of watermarking, being able for these data sets to represent a discernment between what is human generated and what is AI generated, I think is going to be increasingly difficult. So we come into the questions of model collapse, where we have more data that is AI generated, that reflects the bias and weighting of different parameters that already exist in the models, and that feedback loop between narrowing in, essentially, of a view of the world, a representation of the world. And, like, we can already think about that in terms of the technologies that we have, like before Gen AI and before ChatGPT and before this wave of adoption that we've seen over the past 18 months. There has been a narrowing in of our views of the world, purely because of our algorithmically curated social media feeds. Our music, our finances, our spending patterns, these are representations of the world that we have to optimize towards, firstly, engagement, because this is about getting us to continually engage and produce data, essentially, that is a core asset of these big technology companies, be that Spotify or Alibaba or eBay or Google or big financial management and financial services companies. And that narrows in the possibilities. It narrows us towards a mean of views of the world. Like, yes, I like the fact that Apple Music or Spotify gives me a curated list of the things that I've most listened to, but I actually love listening to shit that, like, listening to good music, like shit, but listening to good music that I've never heard before. Genres that that
The long tail, right?
yeah,
Not just
I
the
want to
yeah.
experience the edges.
Yeah.
And I think, there's an interesting risk, existential risk that I've been interested in for a very long time, just around a converging of human thought, a converging of human cognition, both individually and socially and more distributed, that tends us towards a very narrow view of the world, which limits our capacity to imagine things differently, to engage in novel innovation and imagination, which is essential. That diversity in human thought, in human cognition, is essential for life. It's essential for our ability to adapt. And I kind of, and this is to some degree connected to what's called social cooling, which is much more a behavioral phenomenon than that relates to when we're being watched, we change our behavior. So increasing
Yeah.
types of surveillance that we have, that we tend towards social norms and behaviors that are more acceptable, not necessarily preferable, because what might be preferable might actually be things that are about challenge and diversity and diverse viewpoints that we might have around a particular issue. So we've got these dynamics at play in our social environment, in our socio-technical environment, that we're interacting with, that really, firstly, reflect the weird paradigm, the higher order values that might be elevated in everything that we do in our institutions, or what might actually be called the dark matter. Our kind of technocratic institutions, our social norms, our contracts, our ways of interacting with each other, but also, yeah, cultural diffusion, like the meaning making that we're constantly doing, is kind of narrowing in. So we're getting an elevation of the bell curve, not a fatter distribution.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of what I would call performative content, that we're all performing our best selves, to fit the algorithms, and which is why I have often a problem on LinkedIn and other social networks. I know what the algorithm rewards, but often intentionally I don't do these things as a small act of rebellion, because I want to share a link. I don't want to bury the link in the comments just because LinkedIn and other social networks don't like people going to external websites, because they want to keep you there. They want to keep your eyeballs on their feeds. So yeah, and now we see this like generative AI being injected in almost every text field on the internet. So wherever you're prompted to enter your thoughts, view of the world, you have an AI assistant that can help you produce more of that same performative content that it's just fluff. And we see that, especially, like, I think on LinkedIn, everyone is excited to share a new promotion, a new job, a new something. Everyone is so excited about these things that on a large scale don't matter, because it's not how you really form this deeper relationship. It's not what matters at the end of the day. It's not what you will be remembered for. It's not what your kids will remember as meaningful experiences and all of that. So yeah, there's the real danger, and we don't want to go on too long, because we tend to have this hour-long conversation. So perhaps we should try to imagine some concrete ways in which we could feed more diverse data to these AI models, so they can become something that has a different bias towards things that actually matter to humans, not just productivity and GDP. So how do we do that?
Yeah. Uh, I guess there's so many different pathways towards that. Like we've got this pathway, this projected future that we're on, which, we would say is like weird tech, Western educated, industrialized. Uh, we've got this tech creating training data that is creating more of this weird tech that is coming out of this paradigm, this weird paradigm that elevates these values around productivity and efficiency and extraction and separation from life, and the nature and natural world that we're actually part of. Like, so how do we
How do
go
we make
about?
it weird, but not as an acronym,
Yeah,
but truly
not the
weird, right?
acronym weird, like the edge of the distribution
Yeah.
weird. Yeah, and it like coming back to that like uh question of like we do have power and agency. We are the curators of creators of these stories, these representations of the world. And like how do we better coordinate ourselves, if you're listening to this and you relate to what we've been talking about, and you believe that like we need a different representation of the world. Knowing that these technologies are just becoming so integrated into our everyday lives in the way that we do business, the way that civic engagement takes place, so many aspects of our lives. Like, what do we do? And I think we have the power to represent sensory experiences of the world that helps counteract the weirder acronym, weird view of the world, that maybe represents more of the beauty, that's much more poetic, that's much more about our intuitions, our connections, and things that might be considered woo, the things that we connect to around uh, mythology, our past, our deeper sense of spirituality, our desire for meaning and real connection to life. How do we represent that more in the data? Be that like, in what we might post on LinkedIn, because we know that LinkedIn is actually gathering all this data and using it as part of their training data sets. Like, that's one way for us to um, exercise our moral imagination first and foremost, which I think is important as a skill, and increasingly is going to be important as a skill because it's something that can't necessarily be automated, because we know these systems are disembodied. They don't have a direct relationship to the consequences, and moral imagination is born from an embodied person that has its stories extended and embedded in its environment, and the consequences of our decisions are there, be that over longer term or in shorter term. So being able to exercise that through, I don't know, our blog posts or what we write about, what we share on social media, coordinating that, like that might be one way for us to create more data that is human generated, um, at least at part in part, or what can be and can't be discerned is obviously a question. But that's, I guess, an exercise of our agency. If we want to shift these systems, we have to fatten the distribution of representation or distribution of content that we have, that presents a alternative representation of the world.
Yeah,
Like,
so I think there's like a recent study that's been done that calculated that these big tech companies are slowly running out of genuine human data, and there's a real hunger for data, and of course they're starting to produce more synthetic data with these models, which comes with a risk of potential model collapse that we do not understand yet. But yeah, there's the opportunity for us because there's this demand and hunger for data. If we work together and come together to put more woo, not weird data online for models to learn from, there's a real opportunity to have a say in which direction the bias actually tilts. One problem that we've previously discussed is the problem of social infrastructure, both online and in physical spaces. That's, it's been getting harder to have these meaningful conversations as, we have fewer places to meet in person that are not commercially oriented, and same online, and there's like even more AI generated noise. So it is hard, but in some ways, we have to reclaim these social spaces and use them to our advantage. Use the knowledge we have of how these algorithms work and how the training of AI models actually works to counter that. So, not, I mean, obviously, we can still experiment with building something entirely new and different, but also taking advantage of what exists and get creative with, algorithm hacking, and especially coordinated collaborative action on a scale that makes a difference. Because yeah, I often post weird stuff on LinkedIn and it feels lonely, but I realize how important it is for me to sometimes put some more woo stuff out there, because there's people then tell you, yeah, I agree, even if they don't even dare to publicly like or comment on that comment, right? It matters, and the more of us that dare to step outside of what is expected of us, and the ways we usually show up in a performative way in these spaces, we are giving each other the social license to be more woo publicly in a way.
Yeah, reclaiming that that social license to be more human,
Yeah,
to be
weird, not
weird, not in
in
the
an
acronym
acronym way.
sense. Yeah, to be woo, to tap into that woo, to tap into that sixth sense that we have in the way that we orient and make sense of the world in ways that help represent it in all its magnificent beauty. That's much more colorful than maybe the existing data that represents the world has been used to build out these models. And the social, our kind of social infrastructure, both online and kind of in physical embodied life, we lack. Like, we do have these social media environments, these online spaces that just are not necessarily designed for that. They are representations of the weird acronym paradigm in terms of what they're trying to actually optimize for. So how do we first figure out how to evolve more of those spaces online, I think, in particular, because connecting across time and space, across cultures, and representing the plurality or the pluriverse is important. In physical, real life, crucially important as well, connecting as people through our bodies in that embodied experience is valuable. But yeah, telling more stories that represent the woo, writing poems, criticizing the current system, presenting
Offering alternatives.
alternatives,
Yeah.
and doing that at scale, like in some coordinated fashion, I think is going to be really important. Like, we seriously have one generation to create a paradigm shift. Like, there's so many interwoven crises, whether we want to kind of refer to the meta crisis. Bringing up that term at this point in our podcast is probably a bad thing, but I have anyway. So, but we've got so much complexity, and we really have to shift this. And I think these technologies have there is an extraordinary opportunity with these technologies. They're here. They're not going to solve things for us, because I think we have to relate to ourselves, each other, internally, externally, our world, our interconnected, interwoven, interrelated, intersubjective world in new ways. But considering the extent to which these technologies are being used and are being kind of woven into the fabric of everyday life, we kind of have a responsibility to create more woo, to help shift, and ideally create some feedback loop in these systems, in the development of these systems, that maybe we end up with something, ideally, that is closer to Jesus than it is to Elon Musk.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's what we've been doing with the new moon's letter and the full moon gathering, and leaning into the woo a bit. And we also see hope in initiatives like the Wise Innovation Project by Andrew Dunn, who's connecting different practitioners, spiritual people, people of all different walks of life, and things like the Emerald podcast by Josh Wright that we are avid listeners of. So initiatives like this, it's important to create these diverse networks starting online, so we can learn from each other, lean into our woo, and maybe even plan coordinated collaborative civil disobedience online to shift the bias in the data, and eventually start changing things. And as we start doing the work online, obviously it starts bleeding offline in physical spaces, in the conversations we have with people closest to us. And basically, that's what we need to create social tipping points. There's a lot of research that says, it's not actually as difficult as we imagine. We do not have to convince everyone. We just need to start having these conversations and start, like you said, telling different stories. And that's how we change things, and how we achieve also a more diverse data diet for the AI models.
Yeah, and that's a really valuable kind of tension point, I think, in life, that there's this saying that survival comes first, science comes second, or whether we want to talk about science as holistic science in terms of not just the application of ongoing hypothesis testing and empirical evidence and a very quantitative view of the world, but philosophy, deep question, like a love for wisdom, that like there's this tension that like we don't have time. Like most people are just so caught up, cost of living crisis, like the everyday challenges and stresses that we have in our life, this persistent stress that we have limits our imaginative capacities. But we also, like, that comes in tension, I guess, with what you're also talking about. Like, we need more expression of woo, more genuine humanity in our conversations, be that in real life, like at the dinner table, or like at a gathering, talking to your friends, because a lot of those social tipping points come through compounding effects of people shifting our conversations, thinking about and talking about and relating to the things that truly matter to us in our lives. And the more that we do that, the more often that we can do that, I think that gives us a better chance at shifting the paradigm within the next generation.
Yeah. All right. I think we don't want to go on for too long, and we also want to leave space for additional conversations and thoughts. So any closing advice for this first exploration?
Yeah. I mean, being mindful of how we're relating to these technologies, being mindful of this agency and this power that we actually do have. And, sometimes it's only a few minutes, like that next post that you make on LinkedIn or Twitter or Blue Sky or TikTok or whatever. Like, how does that, spending like 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds just reflecting on how that represents the world in a way that we need it to be represented, that challenges uh, the current paradigm that we know we need to shift.
Yeah, if we could maybe pick a final sentence is flood the web with woo.
Yeah. Love it.
All right. Thanks everyone for listening and pathfinding with us. If you enjoyed this exploration, share it with friends to inspire further discussions, leave a review, comment, or send us your thoughts at community@thethics.co. We invite you to embrace the lunacy of tech with smiles and love by subscribing to the Pathfinder's new newsletter and joining our next full moon gathering. We sync our monthly reflections and gatherings to the lunar cycle as a reminder of our place in the universe and a commonality we share across time zones and places we inhabit. Pathfinder's podcast will return during the next waning moon. Until then, choose the food for AI golems wisely and be mindful about the seeds of intention you plant and the stories you tell. There's magic in both.